Hi, this is Shanae Huba, and I'm talking about constitutional rights within disaster policies. The government has a really tough job when disaster hits because the citizens expect their government to take care of them no matter what the cost is. But in the past, we've seen that the cost has often been violation of our constitutional rights. For example, I'll be discussing Hurricane Katrina. During Hurricane Katrina, we saw a lot of instances where the government violated our constitutional rights as listed in the Bill of Rights, which are the first 10 amendments. For example, the First Amendment, which is your freedom of speech and the press, was violated immensely. We saw that FEMA tried to actually restrict the press from taking pictures and publishing pictures of victims and of the dead. FEMA was actually sued by CNN. The lawsuit didn't go through completely because FEMA ended up dropping their zero policy. But the question does arise, if CNN had gone through with the lawsuit, would they even have won? We also saw that the government restricted access to specific areas. Some people were not allowed to go to their place of worship because of possible danger, and the press was not allowed into various disaster sites because of possible threats. So their entire First Amendment right to freedom of speech, freedom of press, and even freedom of religion was violated during Hurricane Katrina. The Second Amendment right was also directly violated, the right to bear arms. During Hurricane Katrina, victims were not allowed to bring firearms into storm shelters. For example, the New Orleans Superdome, housed up to 20,000 refugees during the disaster, and none of them were allowed to bring in firearms. The government also went around door to door confiscating all firearms from different homes. They were trying to protect people because, as we saw in our case studies, oftentimes there's a lot of looting and crime during disasters and during the recovery process. So the government was trying to make sure no one cause any more bloodshed during that time while trying to protect themselves. But it was a direct violation of their Second Amendment right to possess those firearms. Also, for the Fourth Amendment right, some questions were posed as well, like, is forced evacuation a violation of the people's right to be secure in their houses with their own papers and effects? Or is it constitutional for authorities to forcibly remove a citizen from his or her home because of the danger caused by the storm? Many people felt that by being forced to evacuate from their homes, this was a direct violation of their Fourth Amendment right, which deals with search and seizure regulations. There are many more examples, such as the Fifth Amendment right to provision of prosecution, which was violated for many people when habeas corpus was suspended, or the Sixth Amendment right and Seventh Amendment right to a speedy trial and a trial by jury. Close to 8,000 people were imprisoned for way longer than they should have been during this disaster because the whole court system seemed to shut down and there were no public defenders that could really meet and help all of those people. They were way understaffed, for lack of a better term. And this was a direct violation for all of those prisoners that were in jail, mainly for misdemeanors such as public drunkenness or failure to pay a traffic ticket. And then, of course, your Eighth Amendment right to protection from cruel or unusual punishment raised the question for those prisoners. Was it considered unusual punishment for them to stay in jail without power, clean water, or a sewage treatment? And then lastly, there were other, just conflicts of constitutional rights, such as I already mentioned, the freedom of the press. They wanted to be able to post any pictures that they wanted. But this also seemed to violate some people's Ninth Amendment right to privacy. The question arises, by publishing pictures of victims, was the press violating the right of family members to privacy? So on and on, it just proves to be a tricky subject, but fortunately, we've learned from our mistakes and groups have been set in place to help protect our rights during disasters, such as the American Bar Association, which created the rule of law in times of major disaster 2 years after Hurricane Katrina. They basically came out with 12 principles to preserve the rule of law in times of disaster. And then, of course, there's the Interagency Standing Committee, which was established in June of 1992, and it's kind of a universal group that acts as a guide in explaining the rights of all people, and it outlines humanitarian efforts during a disaster or crisis. Great things have come from these groups, such as AB 95, which is a law that was established after Hurricane Katrina that protects the rights of citizens that own firearms. It basically prevents the government from ever trying to confiscate firearms again during an emergency. So I like to believe that we've learned from our mistakes, and that with these groups in place, we can protect our constitutional rights during disaster policies.